To his left is Chief Theo Glover. Chief Glover is head of the Rockford Park District Police Department, but Chief Glover is also the chairperson of the Integrity Task Force Policy Board here today and in that capacity. To his left is Marilyn Height-Ross. Marilyn is the chief of the Criminal Bureau for the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office, but she is also the liaison or designated individual in the State's Attorney's Office to work with the Integrity Task Force. As we have done these investigations in the past, she is the person that works directly with the Integrity Task Force during the course of their investigation. And then when the investigation is completed, she's the one who I have designated to review the Integrity Task Force investigation, provide input and feedback back to the Integrity Task Force, but most importantly, to begin to pull together the decisions and the process that the State's Attorney's Office goes through when reviewing any investigation, but in particular from the task force. To my immediate left is Chief Dan O'Shea of the Rockford Police Department. To his left is Bill Hintz, our Winnebago County coroner, and to his left is the mayor of the city of Rockford, Tom McNamara. I'd like to begin. Everybody okay and ready to go? Thank you. On November 5th, 2017, at approximately 1:03 a.m., Officer Jaimie Cox with the Rockford Police Department in full uniform and driving a fully marked Rockford Police Squad attempted to conduct a traffic stop on a white 1994 Chevy S10 pickup truck. The traffic stop was initiated near the intersection of East State Street and Dawn Avenue in Rockford, Illinois. The driver of the truck was later identified as Eddie Patterson, Jr., who was driving on a revoked driver's license and driving a vehicle with expired registration plates. Upon conducting the traffic stop, Officer Cox advised dispatch that there was a single occupant within the truck. Shortly thereafter, Officer Cox called for backup. Officer Cox attempted to provide an update over the radio that the subject Officer Cox confronted was attempting to elude the stop. This was the last call made by Officer Cox. Dispatch requested his location several times without receiving a response. A call for assistance in locating Officer Cox was dispatched. Responding officers located Officer Cox's squad car, parked and running, near the intersection where the original stop had occurred. However, responding officers noted that Officer Cox was not in nor near the immediate vicinity of his squad car. Shortly thereafter, the white 1994 Chevrolet pickup was located in the parking lot of the Unitarian Universalist Church a few blocks north of Officer Cox's squad car. Officer Cox was located on Dawn Avenue with life-threatening injuries. He was transported to OSF Hospital. Upon arriving at the scene, officers also located Eddie Patterson, slumped over in the seat of the cab of the previously identified pickup. Medical assistance was requested for Eddie Patterson. Patterson was later pronounced deceased. The pickup appeared to have struck a tree at significant speed, causing severe damage to the vehicle. Officer Cox, laying several feet away from the vehicle with significant trauma to his chest. Responding officers were able to transport Officer Cox to the nearest medical facility, OSF St. Anthony Medical Center, where he was pronounced deceased as a result of the injuries sustained during the crash. While removing Eddie Patterson from the truck in order to transport Eddie to St. Anthony Medical Center, the duty weapon identified as to be that of Officer Cox was located inside the cab of the white pickup underneath Eddie Patterson, with missing rounds from the magazine. At this point in time, a determination was made with regards to an investigation. Chief O'Shea contacted the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force and requested that they take over the investigation. It is the procedure and the protocol for the chief or the sheriff of the agency involved to make the determination to contact the Integrity Task Force and request assistance. Chief O'Shea did so, and the Integrity Task Force accepted the investigation. After a review of the investigative materials, it showed that Officer Cox was inside the open driver's door of the vehicle when Eddie Patterson drove off. The evidence further showed that Officer Cox's DNA was found on the gear shift of the vehicle, which would indicate an attempt to shift the truck to park and an attempt to stop the vehicle. Officer Cox had two sets of handcuffs. One set had been removed from his duty belt, which would indicate he was in the process of arresting Eddie Patterson for driving while license revoked. Officer Cox's firearm, his baseball hat, and patch from his uniform were also located in the front cab area of Eddie Patterson's truck. This corroborates what was reported by witnesses who last saw Officer Cox standing inside the driver's side door of the truck. Furthermore, paint transfer from the driver's side interior door was matched to paint transfer on the backside of Officer Cox's uniform pants. There was also a tear in Officer Cox's pants, as well as a pattern-type bruise observed on the right leg of Officer Cox above the knee. This pattern-type bruise located on Officer Cox's right leg appears to be similar to the 3 screws located on the driver's side door frame near the paint transfer. This incident, as I mentioned, was investigated by the Winnebago Boone County Integrity Task Force, and it was subsequently reviewed by the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office, and it was determined that Officer Cox did die as a result of the actions of Eddie Patterson. It is further determined that Eddie Patterson died as a result of Officer Cox's use of deadly force, and that use of deadly force was justified. This time I'd like to move to a PowerPoint presentation that is going to further explain what I have outlined for you here today. To begin with, it is the Rockford Police Department's mission to provide safety and welfare for the people of Rockford so that they enjoy the benefits of being secure in their person, property, and state of mind. The department accomplishes this mission by enforcing the law, preserving peace, preventing crime, controlling traffic, and protecting civil rights and liberties. This is a slide or a picture of Officer Jaimie Cox. The next slide is the Rockford City Police Department's sworn employee code of ethics that each officer is responsible for upholding. The next slide is a brief outline of the Illinois laws and statutes that were also considered. First off, under Illinois law, when an officer, a peace officer, is making use of force use in making an arrest, a peace officer or any person whom he has summoned or directed to assist him need not retreat or desist from the efforts to make a lawful arrest because of resistance or threatened resistance to the arrest. The next applicable statute with regards to a peace officer's use of force in making an arrest can be summarized as that any officer, he or she, is justified in the use of any force which he or she reasonably believes to be necessary to effect the arrest, of any force which is reasonably believed to be necessary to defend himself or another from bodily harm while making the arrest. The next statute indicates that he or she is justified in the use of force likely to cause death or great bodily harm only when he reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm to himself or such other person. And finally, when the officer reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent the arrest from being defeated by resistance or escape, the person to be arrested has committed or attempted a forcible felony which involves the infliction or threatened infliction of great bodily harm in attempting to escape by use of deadly weapon or otherwise indicates that he will endanger human life or inflict great bodily harm unless arrested without delay. The Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office also considered several Supreme Court cases that interpret this area of law. The first is the use of force in general. It talks about the reasonableness of the particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, and the calculus of reasonableness must allow for the fact that the police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular situation. In the case of arrest of the use of force, it has been determined by the Supreme Court that whether force used to effect particular seizure is reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. The question is whether officers' actions are objectively reasonable in light of the facts and circumstances confronting them. And finally, use of force in an arrest where a police officer has probable cause to believe that a criminal suspect poses a threat of serious physical harm either to the officer or to others, it is not constitutionally unreasonable to prevent escape by using deadly force. Thus, if the suspect threatens the officer with a weapon, there is probable cause to believe that he has committed a crime involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious physical harm. Deadly force may be used, if necessary, to prevent escape, and if, where feasible, some warning has been given. The next slide shows the 1994 Chevy pickup after the crash. After the investigation, it is the conclusion that Eddie Patterson's truck was, in fact, in this set of circumstances, converted to a deadly weapon. The next two slides also show Eddie Patterson's 1994 white pickup truck. I'd also like to begin at this time to move through a timeline of events that occurred leading up to the event that we are discussing today. Beginning on Saturday, November 4th, 2017, 1:20 p.m., Eddie Patterson leaves his place of employment at the BMO Harris Bank Center. At 6 p.m., the investigation shows that Eddie Patterson had been making phone calls, 15 outgoing calls, and received 13 incoming calls during this time frame. Continuing with November 4th, at 8:30 p.m., Eddie Patterson texts a friend. This friend later told the police during the investigation that Eddie Patterson had contacted him wanting to buy marijuana. At 12 a.m., witnesses indicated that Eddie Patterson, they believed, was returning home from work and then left saying that he was going to a video store. At 12:56 a.m., Officer Cox, who was on duty in his squad car, as we mentioned, was running license plates, which is typical for a traffic officer to do. At 12:56 a.m., he ran the plate that is identified on the screen through his mobile data computer. At 1 a.m., he ran another plate number through his mobile data computer, again demonstrating that he was carrying out his duties and responsibilities in those early morning hours. At 1:01 a.m., Officer Cox ran the plate of E874950 Illinois plate through his mobile data computer, learning these plates were expired. At 1:03 a.m., the initial traffic stop by Officer Cox of that white Chevy S10 bearing the Illinois plates I mentioned took place along State Street just before the cross street of Dawn. Occupied in that car or vehicle was one person. Witnesses driving by see Officer Cox at the driver's side door of the 1994 white pickup truck. At 1:05 a.m., Officer Cox advises dispatch that he is secure. At 1:07 a.m., Officer Cox runs the name of Carl Thurman through the mobile data command, which returned no record on file. At 1:08 a.m., Officer Cox again runs the name of Carl Thurman, again returning no record on file. At 1:10 a.m., Officer Cox runs the name of Eddie L. Patterson through the mobile data command computer and learns that Patterson's driver's status is revoked. At 1:11 a.m., Officer Cox requests an additional unit to his scene. Seconds later, Officer Cox notifies dispatch he's running. At 1:11 a.m., witnesses report that they saw Officer Cox stopping at a white S10 pickup truck that was moving with Officer Cox on it. 1:11 a.m., there is a video that shows Patterson's truck traveling past 320 Dawn Street at what appears to be a high rate of speed. 1:12 a.m., there is a video that shows Patterson's truck traveling away from the area of 320 Dawn Street at what also appears to be a high rate of speed. This next slide shows Officer Cox's notebook, which demonstrates and shows that he was initially given the name of Carl Thurman, as he has written in his notebook, and then he is later given the name of Eddie L. Patterson. Next slide. Continuing with the timeline here, again, witnesses reports at 1:17 a.m., hearing squealing tires, a vehicle accelerating very fast, and observed a vehicle speeding past what they believed to be with two people inside the vehicle. This would be referring to the white pickup truck. At 1:18 a.m., the 1st Rockford Police Squad travels past 320 Dawn Avenue. At 1:20 a.m., responding police officers locate Officer Cox at 4848 Turner Street, and medical assistance is required. 4848 Turner Street is the church that he mentioned, and on Dawn Street, 320 Dawn Street, there are two residential homes In between that and the corner of Dawn and Turner, at the corner of Dawn and Turner is where you will find the church that I mentioned and the address of 4848 Turner. Now what I'd like to do is I'm going to turn it over to Katie Zimmerman, who has for us the radio transmissions that I have been referring to. And if we can give her a second, she is going to play those radio transmissions for you. Katie?
Sending to a Trauma 1 Center. Trauma 1 Center.
Not working, Katie?
It's not working. My apologies.
Do you want a minute, or shall we continue?
Press Y, please.
Not a problem. Thank you all for giving us a moment to get these up. I think they're important.
Do you want to just move on?
Well, Katie, why don't you work on it for a second, and I will offer you a summary of what the audio transmissions indicate. The audio transmissions are the transmissions back and forth with Officer Cox and dispatch. It's also the transmissions of dispatch calling for Officer Cox after his last transmission and repeatedly requesting his response. And then the last set of transmissions deal with the officers arriving on the scene and locating Officer Cox and the 1994 Chevy truck. So, Katie, you want to move to the squad car slide, please? Okay.
My apologies, you'll probably just have to go, and I'll get it up as soon as I can.
Okay. The next set of evidence that the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force would have considered is the mobile data computer of Officer Cox, which shows that Officer Cox did in fact have the information with regards to Eddie Patterson, which did in fact show that Eddie Patterson was revoked. Also, we have a still photo that is available that was taken from the Mini Mart or the convenience store on State Street that shows Officer Cox's squad car as well as the 1994 Chevy truck parked on State Street, and that the stop had in fact been initiated. We also have a close-up view of that, and we have a video from that convenience store showing the actual stop taking place. The next video that we have available or would be looking at when we get it up and running is the home located at 320 Dawn had a home surveillance system which allowed us to see a video of the 1994 Chevy pickup truck speeding down Dawn Avenue at an extremely high rate of speed. Now, as I mentioned, if you go what is essentially north on Dawn, there are two residents before you hit the corner of Dawn and Turner, and that's where the church that I mentioned is located, and that's where the vehicle eventually came to rest against a tree right there on the corner by the church and by the church's church sign. Next, we would be looking at evidence that was recovered at the scene. We found the handcuffs of Officer Cox. Those handcuffs, one of them was, one side was open, the other side was closed. The second set of handcuffs that Officer Cox had were still on his duty belt. Next, we would be looking at a flashlight that was the duty flashlight issued to Officer Cox. There was then an examination of the vehicle. That examination of the vehicle is where the evidence that mentioned was found, in particular, the duty weapon, the hat, the patch of Officer Cox that was found in the cab of the 1994 Chevy pickup. Also, there were photographs taken, and as I mentioned, of a particular bolt in the driver's door that was identified as the bolt that ripped the pants of Officer Cox and caused the bruising or abrasions located on his leg above his knee. Also, in that particular door, there is a paint transfer that occurred. That paint transfer was matched through testing to the paint that was transferred to the pant leg of Officer Cox's pants, giving us the consistent conclusions that Officer Cox was in fact on that driver's side and up and in the vehicle as we mentioned. Also, the driver's side there is where the analysis was done for DNA. DNA analysis was done on the driver's gear shift, which is where the DNA of Officer Cox was located, demonstrating that Officer Cox did have his hand on the gear shift during this event. The DNA was also located in the driver's seat, matching that of Eddie Patterson. As mentioned, Eddie Patterson was found slumped over the wheel. Also, when Eddie Patterson was located in the vehicle, he was suffering from 2 gunshot wounds, one to the chest and one to the back. During the course of the investigation, and we have photographs of the pants as well as the driver's door, it was determined that the firearm of Officer Cox had been discharged twice at close range. The gunshot residue was on the left side of Officer Cox. And also, during the course of this investigation, these conclusions were confirmed by ballistic testing. The weapon of Officer Cox was located and analyzed by the Integrity Task Force and the State Crime Lab. As mentioned, we also were able to locate the patch of Officer Cox, which was ripped off during the course of the incident. Also available for review during the investigation was the balance of Officer Cox's standard issued uniform, indicating that he was wearing standard issued police uniform, identifying him as a Rockford police officer. He also was wearing a duty issued belt that contained the second set of handcuffs, also his holster, which was empty as his gun was located loose in the cab during the course of the investigation. During the investigation, autopsies were performed on both officers on Officer Jaimie Cox and on Eddie L. Patterson. After the autopsy was performed on Jaimie Cox, it was determined that his cause of death was as a result of multiple injuries to the head, neck, chest, and extremities with internal bleeding due to a motor vehicle crash. A toxicology report was also prepared showing that Officer Cox was positive for the presence of caffeine and a metabolite for nicotine found in the use of cigarettes. The cause of death for Eddie L. Patterson, his autopsy results showed that his cause of death was as the result of one gunshot wound to the left chest and one gunshot wound to the upper back, as well as multiple injuries as a result of the car crash. His toxicology report showed high levels of cocaine and marijuana in his system. During the course of the investigation, the effects of cocaine were considered. Cocaine, you are reminded, is a prohibited substance under the DEA Schedule 11. The effects of cocaine are known to be euphoria, excitement, restlessness, risk-taking, sleep disturbance, and aggression. Also produces mental and physical fatigue. The effects of marijuana, which is also a DEA scheduled prohibited substance on the federal level and is a prohibited substance in Illinois unless you have a medical prescription, is considered to be a Schedule I hallucinogen. It has the effects of a depressant, reality-distorting effects. Chemical compounds comprising marijuana are known as cannabinoids. During the course of this investigation, it was determined that if Eddie L. Patterson had survived the accident, he would have been charged with the following crimes by the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office. First-degree murder, aggravated battery to a police officer, aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, aggravated reckless driving, aggravated DUI, drugs and cocaine in the system, driving while license revoked, obstruction of justice, and resisting arrest. During the course of the investigation, it was also the criminal history of Eddie L. Patterson was reviewed. Eddie L. Patterson had been previously convicted of attempted aggravated battery to a child, criminal trespass to vehicles, battery, burglary, resisting a police officer, domestic battery, retail theft, criminal trespass to land, driving on a suspended license, driving on a revoked license, and operating an uninsured motor vehicle. As previously mentioned, the State's Attorney's Office considered the statutes that I outlined, as well as the law of the United States of America with regards to the interpretation by the Supreme Court as to the use of deadly force. At the conclusion of this investigation, and I'm going to take a second now and just stop before I go into my conclusions, because we're going to give you a chance to see these clips. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say yes, please do, because I think it's important. And I apologize, but I think this is important for everybody to hear.
Maybe. Hold on.
So.
Thank you.
Location and disposition check, please. 82 disposition and location, please. I needed somebody to start over to where he was at Dawn and State. I don't know what direction of travel this subject took off. 82 disposition check. 10-4.
If you have more units, can you start them outdoors at 82? We need to find that out soon.
That's where we're sending all available units. All available units start to dawn and state and keep traffic to a minimum. We're holding on to 82 disposition check and location.
All right, when we pull up, everybody stay away from this car.
Officer Cox, disposition on 2, location and disposition check, please. Officer Cox, location and disposition check. Officer Cox, location and disposition check.
What's this car number, radio? Charles C. Sampson, just 42, looking at, we're gonna start these units going to the north, Turner, Raven, that area, and then units, Dexter, Manheim, Stonegate, that area.
That's where I need units. And we check Hill, Raven, and clear. His car is 165.
Okay, Chelsea and the state car, guys, work your way back here. Let's use the dog to try to find him.
I got him in the church. I got him in the church. He's lit. I need this is Baker 6-2. He's trying to take it. They're trying to take it. 10-4. What church? What 100 block are you at so I can send medical? Turner and back by road or the mobile. Turner and Don, we're getting an ambulance there. 1078 Turner and Don. 1078 Turner and Don. We're en route.
Sending to a Trauma 1 center. Trauma 1 center. Radio, call St. Anthony, tell them we're inbound. Call St. Anthony, tell them we're inbound.
Direct.
Everybody hold perimeter. Keep your eyes open. This subject is 1032.
10-4, hold perimeter, hold traffic.
So what you want to do, I need a fire, an ambulance at the scene up here at the church. There's a J3 still in the truck.
Katie's moving through the photos that I was describing to you orally, location of Officer Cox's hat, another view of the door that I referred to, the bolt that tore Officer Cox's pants and injured his leg. Getting along, Katie, closer view of the bolt that I was referring to. Next, Katie. I believe, can you go back one, Katie? If I remember correctly, the paint transfer is up above there to the left. There's the paint transfer that I referred to. The paint transfer was to the pants of Officer Cox. This is a view of the uniform pants belonging to Officer Cox, showing the paint transfer. Showing both paint transfer and the tear in his uniform. As mentioned, another view of the driver's side door. As indicated, the firearm was discharged twice. Want to go to, can you get back to this picture of Officer Cox's firearm? You can continue, Katie. Another view of the firearm of Officer Cox. This is the patch we referred to that was torn off during the course of the collision or the accident from his uniform. was located in the car. This is a picture of the duty hat that Officer Cox was wearing at that time. A picture of his uniform issued vest, clearly marking and demonstrating he is a member of the police department. Another view of the same vest that he was wearing. This is the duty belt that I referred to, showing his second pair of handcuffs that were still on his duty belt. The next photo is going to show the balance of his duty belt, which shows the holster was empty. Another more clear shot of the tear in the pants of Officer Cox. And this particular one is also shows the paint transfer that we referred to. Okay. Katie, can you go back to the, is it possible to go back to the video so that we could, if you would, please, that would be fantastic. Okay. To move forward. This would be the video that's on State Street. That's Officer Cox's squad car stopping the truck of Eddie Patterson on State Street just before the intersection of Dawn and State. Katie, can you get the video from Dawn itself with the vehicle going by? Or? Okay, thank you. After the investigation was completed by the Winnebago-Boone County Integrity Task Force and subsequently submitted to the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office and was reviewed. It is the opinion of the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office that Officer Jaimie Cox died as a result of the injuries he sustained when Eddie Patterson drove off with Officer Cox essentially inside the vehicle. Furthermore, Officer Cox was legally justified in the use of deadly force or force likely to cause death or great bodily harm at the time he fired his weapon inside Patterson's vehicle, striking him twice. Officer Cox was conducting a legal traffic stop when the vehicle plates returned expired. His inquiries with Eddie Patterson revealed that Eddie Patterson provided Officer Cox with a false name and date of birth, that of Carl Thurman. Officer Cox ran the name and it returned no record on file. Eddie Patterson provided to Officer Cox the name, his given name, Eddie L. Patterson, which was the correct name and date of birth, and it returned that Eddie Patterson's driver's license was revoked. Officer Cox approached Patterson's vehicle with handcuffs to place him under arrest for driving while license revoked. At the time Officer Cox approached Patterson's vehicle, he was driving a marked squad car, he was dressed in his department-issued uniform, and he was wearing the duty belt and hat of a police officer of the city of Rockford. It was at this time that Patterson made a deliberate choice to jeopardize the life of Officer Cox by driving off with him essentially in the vehicle. This is confirmed by the witnesses who saw Officer Cox standing inside the driver's door of Patterson's vehicle shortly before Patterson's truck drove off, and witnesses who also reported Patterson driving with Officer Cox on the vehicle. In addition, there is paint transfer from inside the driver's door to the backside of Officer Cox's pants. There are tears in Officer Cox's pants, and bruising on his body that are consistent with the visible screws in the driver's side door following the crash. A search of Patterson's truck revealed Officer Cox's hat, a duty weapon, and officer's patch of his uniform to be located in the vehicle. DNA testing showed that Officer Cox's DNA was on the gear shift, which would indicate that he was attempting to shift the truck into park in an effort to stop the vehicle and save his life. Officer Cox's duty weapon was fired while in Patterson's truck. This is corroborated by the location of the 2 shell casings on the passenger side of the floorboard, as well as Officer Cox's weapon being located inside Patterson's truck underneath Patterson. Lab testing further confirmed that when Officer Cox fired his weapon, he was inside the cab of Patterson's vehicle and that Patterson was in the driver's seat, as Patterson's DNA was identified in the driver's seat. At the time Eddie Patterson drove off with Officer Cox in the vehicle, he was committing the following offenses: driving while license revoked, aggravated battery to a police officer, obstruction of justice by providing a fictitious name and date of birth, resisting arrest, aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, the truck, attempted first-degree murder of a police officer. During this time, Officer Cox was confronted with a deadly force assailant. Patterson was using his vehicle to assault Officer Cox. In an effort to prevent death or great bodily harm to himself, Officer Cox fired his weapon twice, striking Patterson in the chest and upper back. The autopsy report concluded by Dr. Wittig determined that Officer Cox died as a result of the injuries he sustained from the vehicle driven by Patterson. This was an intentional act by Patterson to drive with Officer Cox in the vehicle. Under the laws of the state of Illinois, an individual commits the offense of first-degree murder when he either intends to kill an individual or knows that his acts will cause death or great bodily harm to an individual, or knows that his acts create a strong probability of death or great bodily harm to an individual. Patterson's actions escalated a routine traffic stop to a deadly force situation. When Patterson drove off with Officer Cox in the vehicle, Patterson became a deadly force assailant. As such, Officer Cox was legally justified under the laws of the state of Illinois and under the laws of the U.S. Supreme Court to use deadly force in protecting his life. Dr. Wittig determined that Patterson died from 2 gunshot wounds and injuries sustained in the crash. Patterson also contained and did have present cocaine and marijuana in his system. Therefore, after review of the investigative materials, it is the opinion of the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office that had Patterson survived, he would have been charged with the murder of Officer Jaimie Cox. Under the laws of the state of Illinois, a person commits the offense of first-degree murder when he intends to kill or do great bodily harm to an individual, or he knows that the acts will cause great bodily harm or death to the individual, or he knows that his acts create a strong probability of death or great bodily harm to that individual. In this situation, Patterson's actions created a strong probability of death or great bodily harm to Officer Cox. Officer Cox's use of deadly force was legally justified because he was confronted with deadly force by Patterson. Officer Cox reasonably believed that in order to defeat the threat against his life, he had to respond with force likely to cause death or great bodily harm. He was legally justified in the use of deadly force to prevent the arrest from being defeated when he was met with resistance. He was legally justified in the use of deadly force to arrest without delay a fleeing felon who had driven away with him in the truck. Therefore, it is the opinion of the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office that Officer Jaimie Cox's actions were legally justified given the circumstances he encountered and under the laws of the state of Illinois and under the applicable laws of the United States Supreme Court regarding the officer's use of deadly force. It is important to remember that in Supreme Court cases such as Graham versus Connor, the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, and its calculus must embody an allowance for the fact that the police officers are often forced to make split-second decisions about the amount of force necessary in a particular situation. In this case, Officer Cox was placed into the situation created by Eddie Patterson, where he had to use deadly force against Patterson. Therefore, under Graham versus Connor, the Supreme Court case I just mentioned, his actions were objectively reasonable in light of the facts and the circumstances confronting him at the time Patterson drove off with Officer Cox in the vehicle. Furthermore, Patterson was committing the forcible felony of aggravated battery to a police officer and attempted first-degree murder of a police officer when he drove off with Officer Cox in his vehicle at a high rate of speed. Patterson's approximate speed at time of impact was 58 miles per hour, and Patterson was committing the offense of obstruction of justice when he provided Officer Cox with the fictitious name of Carl Thurman to avoid being arrested for driving while his license was revoked. Patterson was committing the offense of aggravated driving while under the influence of alcohol with both cocaine and marijuana in his system. Patterson was committing the offense of aggravated reckless driving by driving his vehicle at excessive speeds and causing great bodily harm to Officer Cox. These are the conclusive findings of the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office. At this time, I'd like to make the following statement. This case is a reminder that when a law enforcement officer engaged in his official duties conducts a routine traffic stop, that individual should be compliant. In this particular case, Officer Cox, who was conducting a lawful stop, would have ended his shift alive. And furthermore, Patterson would have been arrested for obstruction of justice and driving while license revoked, and quite probably would have posted bond and gone home safely to his family as well. This investigation, I know, has been thorough and has been complete. As the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office and as the sitting state's attorney, I am satisfied with the investigation that the Winnebago Boone Integrity Task Force has completed. I'd like to, at this time, invite Chief Glover up here to make a couple of brief comments on behalf of the Integrity Task Force Policy Board at this time. Chief Glover, if you would, please.
Thank you, Joe. I think we all can agree that this presentation that you've just seen is very compelling. It's always a difficult task when we're called out to do investigations, but these guys always do an excellent, tremendous job while they're out doing their investigations, conducting everything that they need to do to bring the case to a close. We, when called out, will never conduct a cursory investigation. We're always thorough in what we do, and I'm confident that we did this in this particular investigation. But there begs that question that's out there that everyone wants an answer to. Why has it taken so long to bring this to a close? I will at this time bring Commander Sam Thomas up to be able to answer that question as best he can and give some insight to that. Thank you. Sam.
Thank you, Chief. Many times, we're fortunate enough that these investigations include an element of human information, being that we have observations by witnesses or statements from those that are directly involved in the incident. The biggest challenge that we faced with this investigation is we had limited information of that nature, predominantly because the two individuals that were directly involved in this, Eddie Patterson and Jaimie Cox, were deceased. Because of that, we became more reliant on physical evidence and information from the scene itself to try to piece all the parts together to tell the story of what happened during that incident. That involved significant, tedious analysis of pieces of evidence at the state crime lab, and that extended the time frame of bringing this investigation to a close. We did receive our final analysis report last Friday on July 6th. That was forwarded to the state's attorney's office. I can assure you that we had been in constant contact with the state's attorney's office in reviewing the information as it came in since the inception of the investigation. And I think as a task force, we have an obligation to the two families of Eddie Patterson and Jaimie Cox, as well as the Rockford Police Department and the city of Rockford, to do as comprehensive investigation that we can. And I think that we accomplished that and are able to tell the story as best as possible.
Thank you, Sam. A couple pieces of follow-up. Just if it wasn't clear, the Integrity Task Force was providing updates on their investigation so that we could review the investigation. Essentially, Maryland was as it was going on, so that we could have this concluded as quickly as possible. That's why when the last lab report came in on July 6th, we're able to have this press briefing by July the 12th. So it was good, hard work all the way along. Also, a reminder that the Integrity Task Force is the creation and collection of all the law enforcement agencies here locally. When the Integrity Task Force is invoked, a unit is selected that does not contain officers from the affected agency. That's what allows for the integrity piece. That has been very, very successful model here locally and continues to be so. Now I'd like to invite our coroner, Bill Hintz, up so that Coroner Hintz can tell you where he is with his responsibilities as coroner and give you an update as to what he expects to be doing going forward. I can tell you that the coroner has been working closely with us during this investigation, and with the investigation completed, he can take the next steps responsible that he has under Illinois law. Coroner Hintz.
Thank you, sir. The coroner's office is charged with many different responsibilities. Two of the most important ones that I believe are to determine the cause and the manner of death. We do that several different ways. As you heard, we had an autopsy procedure with both Officer Cox and Mr. Patterson. During that autopsy procedure, we have several different studies and tests that we do. The forensic pathologist then determines, and as you heard, the cause of death for both individuals. The next step is gathering the further evidence, working closely with the Integrity Task Force, with the state's attorney's office, making sure that the evidence that they presented to the different agency to come back with their findings, that is the last part we need to determine the manner of death. This evidence, the reports, everything will be presented to a coroner's jury in due time, and at that point, they will determine what the exact manner of death is. I do want to thank everybody that's been helping us through this process. It's been very difficult, but we're doing the best we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Coroner Hintz. I'd like to at this time invite Chief O'Shea to the podium to make a statement on behalf of the Rockford City Police Department. Chief.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the Integrity Task Force and the State's Attorney's Office for completing the investigation, a very thorough investigation, providing everyone with the results. At this point, the Rockford Police Department, we will take all the investigation conclusions and all of the investigative notes, and we will conduct an administrative review, as our policy is, internal administrative review. Anytime we have a deadly force incident, we do an extensive review to make sure that we're doing, the officers are doing what they're supposed to do, and that we are providing the best training and our policies are up to place. Beyond that, there is no statement with regards to the case. There is ongoing pending civil litigation, so we are refraining from further comment on the case at this time.
And I'd like to at this time ask the mayor of the city of Rockford, Tom McNamara, to step up and make a brief statement on behalf of the city.
Thank you, Mr. Bruscato. On behalf of all the citizens of the city of Rockford, I want to first thank the Integrity Task Force for the fine work that you've done. The care and concern that you've shown is truly appreciated. So on behalf of the citizens, thank you. So these are one of those times that, as mayor, you really hope never happens. But on November 5th, we as a community and our police department faced a terrifically tragic incident. I think what that does is it certainly reminds us of the risks and sacrifices that all of our first responders take when they get ready in the morning and walk out their homes. I think it also reminds us of the sacrifices and dedications that those first responders' families also provide to our city. So on behalf of the city of Rockford, I just want to thank all of our first responders and their families for the sacrifices and dedications that they make to all of us to make sure that we are safe. I also want to just thank Chief O'Shea for his tremendous leadership during probably the most trying time in his career. I want to thank the entire police department for their leadership that they have shown over the last several months. And I want to thank all the City of Rockford employees. They have shown tremendous passion and care and respect for their fellow employees by standing up and supporting them. And lastly, I just want to thank all the citizens of Rockford. On November 5th, we face this unspeakable tragedy and really senseless tragedy. But all of the citizens of Rockford came together as only Rockfordians do during really difficult times. And they came together to support our police department. They came together to support one another and all those involved in this incident. And I just want to thank them and encourage them to continue to show that sense of unity and togetherness over the coming days, weeks, and months. And again, I'll turn it back over to State's Attorney Joe Bruscato.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to open it up for questions, as is the tradition with press conferences at the State's Attorney's Office. I'd like to recognize the person who's the Dean of the Press Corps for the day, and today that's going to be Georgette.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. Is there any concern about anything in the community? Are there any extra steps being taken for security anywhere, or is there concern about
Chief?
this?
Well, I don't think here in Rockford we will have issues. We are always preparing and prepared. I invite anyone who has any issues, concerns, to please contact me. I will gladly sit down with any person, any group, and hear their concerns and work with them as best I can within the confines of what I'm allowed to do. But I don't foresee too much on the horizon, but we are always prepared for instances should they arise.
I'd like to piggyback off that and indicate that both the Cox family and the Patterson family were contacted and meetings were scheduled at the same time as this press conference, so they could be receiving the results of this press conference while you all were receiving it and the community was receiving it as well. As Chief O'Shea has indicated we have nothing that, at this point in time, that's come to our attention that concerns us, but we always remain vigilant and responsible and responsive. Next question, please. Mary.
A little bit about Officer Cox's DNA being found on that gear shifter.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit maybe about what protocol is if a suspect is trying to elude, if that's something that is maybe traditionally taught to officers, or how, what's at their, I guess, their power in a situation like that.
I'm going to ask Chief O'Shea to come up one more time.
So every traffic stop is unique and individual. There is no set protocol for how to deal with anyone on every traffic stop or every contact we have. So it's, as the Supreme Court has ruled, I mean, things are very fluid on every contact we have. So the protocol is, there is no set protocol. We teach officers and we train officers how to protect themselves and other citizens and deal with what they're dealt with right then and there. And they make split-second decisions, and they do it every day. So the answer is there is no set protocol for that.
We began the presentation with the city's mission statement as well as their some of their ethical responsibilities to try to give you a backdrop as to the framework with which they begin their job and their decision process. And then it just goes from there with regards to what their procedure and protocol is, what the laws are, and all of that is what goes into their choices they make and actions that they take.
I guess
Rihanna.
this question would be for the task force. I know you mentioned two of the major challenges in this investigation were the fact that both the parties were dead, but two, also that you had to rely on evidence from the scene. Is there any other challenges that kind of kept us from getting this information until today?
Well, I'll begin and then I'll turn it over to Sam. The lab tests is what we were waiting on. And the state crime lab is a finite resource. There's only so much manpower and tools available to them. So they have to process things in the time it takes for them to get it done. They completed the last test and supplied that to us on Friday, July 6th of last week. That's essentially the reason why there appears to be a longer period in time than people would expect. I'm going to tell you up front that every case, every investigation takes the amount of time that is necessary to complete it, and we don't rush through it because we want a completion, a conclusion that we can count on that is thorough. But I recognize that human nature is such that people would like things sooner than later. We were cognizant of that. That's why we began reviewing the evidence as it was coming in so that we could be prepared as soon as it was completed. But other than that, that was the reason why this case took what gave people the impression that it was longer. But like I said, every investigation should take the amount of time that is necessary. There is no assigned timeline. We want to do it right. And, but we recognize that people would like to see things sooner than later, so we try to balance those with each other. Do you have anything to add to that, Sam? Please.
I'd only add two more things. Number one, in essence of the timeline, on last Friday, July 6th, that was 8 months almost to the date from the incident happening. That's not out of the realm of of any type of death investigation. Anyone that's standing up front here can tell you that that's certainly within the parameters of the time it would take to conduct a death investigation. Sometimes, you know, they may take even longer than that. Secondly, with your question about how long it took to get the information to you folks, there was never any intention to withhold information, but there was an intention to make sure that you had all the information at its completion, and that's what we're doing today.
Please continue. Any other questions?
This question is for O'Shea. You mentioned an administrative review that you'll be conducting. What all goes into that review?
We assign command personnel to take all the reports and go through, and we're looking at our internal training and policies to make sure we try and not get into deadly force situations. And then when we do, or we have serious incidents, we conduct an extensive review. Are we training the best? Are our policies the best? Are we doing things the best manner we can inside the Rockford Police Department? But we couldn't do that, obviously, until we have all the reports. And we'll go through it, and we do it in every deadly force situation or critical incidents. And it's just a manner of a check and balance internally on our own to make sure we're performing and doing as best we can.
Please continue.
Do you guys have the exact number of how many officers or squad cars then responded once that call was made?
I'll give that to,
I don't know.
I mean, dozens upon dozens.
yeah. Very clearly, there was, a large presence and response. Exact number, apologize, is not a figure that was tallied or kept. I'm sure that something that could be determined, but it's safe to say that the response was quick, as you could tell from the audio. It was quick, it was immediate, and it was appropriate.
Who all is a member of the task force, like an entire list?
All the law enforcement agencies that affect Winnebago County and Boone County are members of the task force. And then they are split up into 3 units.
3 squads.
3 squads, and then when a task force request is made by the Winnebago or Boone County Sheriff or one of the police chiefs from Winnebago or Boone, then a squad is determined to be selected that doesn't involve officers from that department. That selection is made by the commander, Sam Thomas, working in connection with the head of the task force policy board, that being Chief Glover.
Was there at any point during the investigation that it was found that Officer Cox was at all hit by Patterson's truck?
I'm going to let Sam talk about this, but the investigation showed essentially that Officer Cox was trying to get Eddie Patterson under arrest. At the time he was trying to get him under arrest, Eddie Patterson took off. At the time that he took off, he was located inside the door and the cab and got caught up in that process and was trying to get the vehicle to stop. As the speed, they turned down on Dawn and headed straight down Dawn to Turner, where the crash ended, at extremely high rate of speed. And it was at that time that Officer Cox had to make the determination on how to stop the vehicle, involve his life, potentially lives of others as well, if anybody could have been on the street at that point in time, but stopping the vehicle and, clearly, getting that vehicle stopped also could have prevented the loss of life of Eddie Patterson. So those actions needed to be taken as that was a developing incident. It was, Chief O'Shea has said, very fluid, very immediate. But in conclusion, the actions taken by Officer Cox are justified under the laws of the state of Illinois and the U.S. Supreme Court. Next question, please.
Just to clarify, Officer Cox was transported to the hospital in a police car?
Yes, I believe that is correct. That is correct, because he was located at the scene by Rockford City Police. Determination was made, I'm drawing a conclusion here, that more immediate medical attention could be given if he was put in the back of a squad and driven over there. Also, medical vehicles were dispatched once Eddie Patterson was located as well to tend to his injuries as well. Both were substantial and life-threatening upon locating both individuals. I think that's a safe conclusion. Correct, Sam? While anybody's thinking about other questions, a couple of housekeeping details. If anybody needs a one-on-one, Katie is here and Christy is here on behalf of the City Police Department. She's their new Public Information Officer. Katie's obviously for the State's Attorney's Office, but both will assist you. Also, Katie has kindly prepared a press release, which will be distributed to each of you as you leave, and as we always do, we will distribute it electronically to everybody on our distribution list, so you have an electronic version as well. any more questions that everybody here can answer for you. If later in the day you come up with a question, please feel free to contact Christy or Katie so that we can get back to you with the information, help you prepare your stories, and get information to the public. We would be glad to assist. Just so you know, this does conclude the investigation and does conclude the review by the Winnebago County State's Attorney's Office. We do not anticipate any further action will be taken, at least for this stage of the process. As indicated, the coroner will now take over for his responsibilities, and Police Chief Dan O'Shea and the City Police Department will begin their administrative process. Is there any other questions that we can answer for you today to help provide information? I want to thank you all very much for being here. I also want to thank all our media partners for the coordination of this press conference, and your professional courtesy was just excellent. And also want to thank you for your patience. We did put together a rather extensive presentation, but I think it was important to do it this way. So the information that was available to the public, we wanted to make sure was as thorough and as open as possible. And so thank you for taking the time to listen to the presentation patiently. I appreciate it deeply. With that, we will conclude today's press conference. Thank you.